This lecture comprises an introduction to Old Testament theology. Well, we've already begun to introduce some things about postmodern Old Testament theology. And John Goldingay is sometimes classed in this way as well in his 3 volumes, so we can look at that. But let's begin with Walter Brueggemann in 1997. Brueggemann's postmodern perspective readily appreciates any diversity within the Old Testament. In fact, diversity seems to be an essential element for anything postmodern. Brueggemann sees the texts as diverse, and then he also sees those writing Old Testament offering diverse voices. And so we have diversity both in terms of the text of the Old Testament as well as the readers and Old Testament theologians. He speaks of this diversity in the Old Testament in terms of testimony. And his synchronic approach to Old Testament theology, reading the text flat, allows him to set parts of the testimony over against other parts, what he calls counter-testimony. There's testimony about God, but this testimony is, quote, inescapably disputatious and disjunctive. Now, how do we get behind that kind of a thought? Well, just think, for example, of the statements in the Old Testament where God is revealing himself, and then a book like Job, where the question is, where is God in my suffering? And so that would be the kind of approach that Brueggemann takes. And he actually is celebrating this diversity, these diverse voices in the Old Testament. Brueggemann's theology of the Old Testament, he says on page 713, I have proposed that Old Testament theology focus on Israel's speech about God. He says, a focus on speech avoids the tendency to focus on historicity of events in the Old Testament and on a concern for being. So here he's not trying to reconstruct Israel's history or to look at God's being per se, but rather Israel's speech about God. This approach involves an observation about the nature of the Old Testament. It speaks about God and an adoption of a postmodern perspective in which diverse voices are listened to. And on page 716 he says, the Old Testament theology, in its attempts to honor the plurality of the text, will have to reckon with the cruciality of speech as the mode of Yahweh's actuality, the disputatious quality of truth, and the lived, bodied form of testimonial communities. Of course, in postmodernity, there's a lot of emphasis on communities constructing truth and communities having different ways of seeing the world. And that then is what we're finding here in Brueggemann. We're hearing the different testimonies of the communities, plural, in the Old Testament. Now, with respect to speech as the mode of Yahweh's actuality, Brueggemann writes, I shall insist, an interesting thing for a postmodern to do, as consistently as I can, that the God of Old Testament theology as such lives in, with, and under the rhetorical enterprise of this text, and nowhere else and in no other way. This rhetorical enterprise operates with ontological assumptions, but these assumptions are open to dispute and revision in the ongoing rhetorical enterprise of Israel. And then he says, secondly, with respect to the disputatious quality of truth, quote, we are now able to recognize against any hypothesis of a unilateral development of Israel's religion or Israel's God talk that the texts themselves witness to a plurality of testimonies concerning God and Israel's life with God. Several testimonies to Yahweh were often in profound dispute with one another, disagreeing from the ground up about the truth of Yahweh. And so, for example, he might point out the dispute that can be set up in the Old Testament between Job and his speech about God and Jeremiah. Continuing with the quotation, in the end, it is clear that the final form of the text in its canonizing process did not feature a complete hegemonic victory for any interpretive trajectory. So we have diversity in the Old Testament. And then thirdly, he says, with respect to the lived, bodied form of testimonial communities, that he intends to investigate Israel's testimony of Yahweh in the Torah, king, prophet, cult, sage, and other modes of mediation and life with Yahweh. So this approach gives shape to Brueggemann's Old Testament theology. He first looks at Israel's core testimony about Yahweh in verbal, adjectival, and metaphorical speech. Secondly, then, he introduces Israel's counter-testimony, such as experienced in the hiddenness, ambiguity, and negativity of God, and in Israel's questioning of God. Is God abusive, contradictory? Is he unreliable? Then the third approach in his Old Testament theology is to explore Israel's unsolicited testimony. So we have Israel's core testimony, Israel's counter-testimony, and now Israel's unsolicited testimony, in which Israel, the human person, the nations, and creation are seen as Yahweh's partner. And then fourthly, and finally, he explores Israel's embodied testimony of Yahweh through the Torah, the king, the prophet, the cult, and the sage, and various modes of mediation and life with Yahweh. Israel's core testimony, Israel's counter-testimony, Israel's unsolicited testimony, and Israel's embodied testimony of Yahweh are the four parts of Brueggemann's Old Testament theology. Now, Brueggemann has an article that I'd like to point out with just a few pages. Within just a few pages, he discusses what he's up to when he's writing a postmodern biblical theology. The title of the work is Biblical Theology Appropriately Postmodern. And by postmodern, Brueggemann means the loss of hegemonic privilege among Christian interpreters, or alternatively among the ruling class of critical scholars. He says further, First Testament theologians such as Gerhard von Rad and Walter Eichrodt represent the past supersessionism, Euro-Christian assumptions of transcendence, and with it the capacity to set forth a singular, comprehensive model for First Testament theology that serves both the theological and the cultural interests of Christian domination. He adds Brevard Childs to the list as well. The change can be found in contemporary scholars' awareness of their inevitable reading from a given perspective. One's idiosyncratic readings, such as we have even in Preuss's Old Testament theology published in 1995, recently to when Brueggemann is writing. Initially, Brueggemann notes that the postmodern biblical theologian will recognize that, 1, she speaks among many other legitimate voices. 2, will desire that biblical theology will derive not according to the long privileged categories of Christian dogmatics, but more nearly permits the categories of interpretation to arise from the text itself. 3, will recognize that the text of Hebrew Scriptures itself is plurivocal, and therefore not systematic and permissive of a variety of methods of interpretation and interpreting communities. And fourth, will turn from history as the controlling category of interpretation to hermeneutical enterprises concerned with narrative, metaphor, imagination, all inviting open-ended playfulness, which does not insist on conformity and leaves room for conversation. And in that, again, notice that he is talking about how interpreters do Old Testament theology this way, but also he's finding that to be the case in the Old Testament itself, that it is plurivocal and even contradictory. Brueggemann then offers the following three characteristics of postmodern biblical theology. Process of interpretation. First, biblical theology seeks thematization, but this ultimately fails, for the text refuses to allow it. The text is saturated with disjunctions and contradictions that mark it as an endlessly deconstructive enterprise, and therefore our thematizations are likely to be quite local and quite provisional. So Eichroth's theme was covenant, pertinent to the time of National Socialism in Germany. Von Rad ultimately recognized the inadequacy of the thematization of historical traditions on which he had spent his primary energy, he says, with respect to another work of Von Rad, Wisdom in Israel. Thus, thematization is not substantive, but processive. The theological substance of Hebrew Scripture is essentially a theological process of vexed, open-ended interaction and dialogue between the Holy One and all those other than the Holy One. And in this he finds both attentiveness and abrasion and disjunction in the I-thou relation of Israel and God. He also talks about dialogic transactions that offer a crucial alternative to Cartesian positivism. And that's a reference then to the modernist period that thought it could build a clear system of truth, but rather truth is dialogical. The text functions as testimony in a law court. It is a witness, and as such brackets out all questions of being, ontology, and all questions of happening, history. It proceeds in a dialect of core testimony and counter-testimony. And although I'm describing this with a lot of quotation from this article, we keep coming back to the same kinds of points. And so his three rubrics in this dialectic testimony can be listed simply as follows. We have here opposites. Covenant and exile is the first. The pivotal focus of the Hebrew Scripture on exile destabilizes the assurance of covenant. Then we also have a dialectic between hymn and lament. Hymn, hymn and lament. Every interpreter of Scripture knows that the core testimony of hymns is endlessly accompanied by lament and complaint that subvert the great doxological claims. And then we also, thirdly, have presence and theodicy. While presence of God is a crucial understanding in Israel, Israel is given finally to theodicy, to the question of God's reliability, God's presence, God's willingness to be connected to Israel. Brueggemann also looks at openness to ambiguity and contradiction then. He says, church interpreters of Hebrew Scripture must resist the Christian propensity to closure. That is, to resolve exile in terms of covenant, to end complaint with doxology, to let God's presence triumph over theodicy. Quote, "It is clear to me that the deconstructive dialectic of the Hebrew Scriptures is indeed characteristically and intransigently Jewish in its openness to ambiguity and contradiction, as it as is reflected in midrashic interpretation. So Brueggemann finds the ongoing deconstructive dialectic continued in the Christian symbols of cross, negative for him in this case, and resurrection, positive, although one has to ask whether that is a proper way of understanding cross and resurrection. He also explores the local and provisional, which is key to any postmodern discussion. He says, I do not concede with Childs that Jew and Christians read different Bibles, nor do I grant the same point when made from a Jewish perspective by a scholar like John Levinson, a Jewish scholar. His book is called Why Jews Are Not Interested in Biblical Theology, published in 1993. He says, my own angle on interpretation is that we read together a testimony to the elusive one, who is endlessly rendered and re-rendered, around whom has gathered a rich inheritance of testimony consisting in image, metaphor, and narrative, acts of imaginative construal that admit of no single reading, but that generate many possible futures. Like every interpreter, I read locally and provisionally. I read with certain habits and interests as a tenured white Christian male, and so do all of my companion readers read locally and provisionally. Now somehow Brueggemann compromises this approach, it seems to me, by objectifying the, quote, larger human crisis confronting all readings, a crisis of injustice, suffering, failure, and so forth. With the images of Friday and Sunday to hand, Brueggemann proposes that, quote, all our reading is Saturday reading between the Good Friday and the Easter Sunday. It must be, he says, if resolution of any kind is not, this isn't his wording, it's mine. It would have to be a Saturday reading on a postmodern approach, since a postmodern approach, by definition, cannot find resolution and wants to be open-ended and provisional. Now, while John Goldingay affirms the belief that the Old Testament theology is biblical, it is something that is to be undertaken by Christians who can only make theological judgments vis-a-vis the New Testament. Goldingay also insists that the texts need to be heard in their own right. And this means appreciating for him, as well as with Brueggemann, that the Old Testament has diverse voices. But biblical theology is not merely reconstructive, it's actually constructive. We put the pieces together and thus create meaning above that which any one text by itself has. So Goldingay does not see this as resulting in contradictions, but in complementary parts of Scripture. The point being somewhat simply that Goldingay is similar to Brueggemann, but not quite as radical. John Goldingay at Fuller Theological Seminary has now completed his Old Testament theology in 3 volumes. The first volume is subtitled Israel's Gospel, and looks at Old Testament narratives. The focus is on the people of Israel with their story. Now, the biblical gospel in this language is not a dogma, but a narrative about things God has done. So once again, we're looking at the acts of God as Old Testament theology. But he says, in a postmodern direction, this narrative is not complete, and the New Testament does not bring it to completion. One thing narrative does is come closer to the complexity of reality. The other volumes are Israel's Faith, which looks at faith throughout the Old Testament, and volume 3 is Israel's Life, and it looks at the ethos of Israel. I guess Israel's life is the best way to put it, especially in terms of the Psalms and instruction in Torah. Our study of Old Testament theology leads us to the question of what are the issues then in Old Testament theology. And while so much more could be said about the history of Old Testament theology and mentioning of different names that have contributed to this, we now come to try to draw some things to a close here around this question of what are the issues that have arisen in our study. And so first of all, we might mention the relationship of historical studies to theological studies, and that within the Old Testament as well as beyond it. Old Testament theology, is it more historical or is it more theological? Secondly, should Old Testament theology be related to systematic theology? Has been another kind of question, and Francis Watson has been one of the recent scholars who has tried to show more of a relationship between these two different fields of study in theology, biblical studies and systematic theology. Also, an issue that has arisen is the relationship of events to interpretation of events. We've explored that with von Rad in particular. Another issue is, are we dealing with an Old Testament or a Hebrew Bible? In other words, is Old Testament studies something that should be conducted as if the New Testament hadn't happened? Hear it on its own terms, not looking forward to its fulfillment in the New Testament, done as an academic discipline without faith commitments, or something that can be done by Jews as well as by Christians. And this is a question that has led to different answers in Old Testament theology. Another issue is the relationship of the Old Testament to the New Testament, or the Old Testament to something else, if you're talking about the Jewish tradition, that is, the Mishnah and the Talmud, and its interpretation of Old Testament documents, particularly the laws. On this issue, we have noted some ways in which people have brought together the Old and New Testaments. One is to talk about covenants. Another is to explore various other themes, perhaps God and his self-revelation, perhaps redemption, perhaps even trying to look at Christ in the Old Testament and Christ in the New Testament, and so forth. Typology has been a way of connecting the Old and New Testaments, particularly with von Rad and many others. And narrative approaches have attempted to connect Old and New Testaments in a way that can overlap with typology, can overlap with covenant, can even overlap some with themes, a thematic approach, but a more narrative approach to the subject. And so then that's one of the issues of whether we're dealing with more unity and more diversity, and how do we get there? Or what about some other issues? Where does meaning lie is quite an important question to ask, both for the task of exegesis and for the task of biblical theology. Someone like Brueggemann says we need to move from establishing the history to talking about how texts are interpreted, and so readers become far more important in determining meaning. But Brevard Childs also said that exegesis is not just a matter of description, it's also about interpretation in his canonical approach. So the issue of a certain point of view arises. What is the point of view of not just the author, but also the community using this material, or the readers in the present time? Another issue is the New Testament's use of the Old Testament. This raises questions about how to interpret the Old Testament on its own terms. Should we take into consideration the actual interpretations of Christian authors in the New Testament? And is that authoritative for how the Old Testament should be read? How do we engage that dialogue of the New Testament and its use of the Old Testament? Some see great discontinuity, and some see a lot of continuity on that issue. Another issue is, how do our assumptions and methods of study relate to biblical authority and to Christian faith? We are Christians interpreting sacred texts, as Brevard Childs would point out. And so we need to acknowledge openly who we are as interpreters of these texts, and not pretend that we don't have a faith as we engage in our scholarship. This is a point that Paul House makes in his work on Old Testament theology. How should the Old Testament be used by Christians then? And this is just a broadening out of the last point into where we use the Old Testament and what purposes we make, what work we put it to. For example, in sermons, do we tend to use the Old Testament just as a way of picking up some illustrations for what we're preaching, and what we're preaching is mainly from perhaps the New Testament, or more topical preaching, or preaching out of our systematic theologies, in which case we're doing more proof texting when we turn to Scripture, particularly the Old Testament? It's very important to ask the question, how often do we actually use the Old Testament? How much does the Old Testament mean in our churches and in our personal reading of Scripture and in our Christian lives? Do we read the Old Testament with Christian lenses? Do we study the Old Testament on its own terms first, and then try to add a second stage of interpretation where we look at it through the New Testament eyes? Do we see the Old Testament as a failed religion, as has often been the case in German scholarship in the past? What about the law and the Christians' use or non-use of the law? Or do we see some more continuity between the Old and New Testaments? Does the Old Testament not just get developed further in the New Testament, but actually have certain themes that might not even be mentioned in the New Testament that are important for Christian faith? And these are some of the issues that we have identified as we've gone through our study of the Old Testament. Now, we haven't mentioned some theologies by certain evangelicals, and these aren't. This isn't a full list of them, but I wanted to bring to your attention several. And the reason I haven't worked them into the previous lecture is that they don't raise significant issues other than the issue of Christian faith and our reading of Scripture as Christians. But rather, scholars like these engage the questions along similar ways that some of the other authors doing Old Testament theology do as well. Walt Kaiser, in his Towards an Old Testament Theology, sees the central theme of the Old Testament as the promise of God. So he's in a promise fulfillment kind of presentation. Elmer Martins, in his work God's Design, a focus on Old Testament theology, looks at God's design from a specific text, Exodus 5:22 to 6:8, and he sees that text introduces four themes for Old Testament theology: deliverance, community, knowledge of God, and abundant life. Paul House approaches Old Testament theology very much book by book. What is the theology of this book? Now, what's the theology of this book? And while accepting that there's not a central theme, the focal point that he chooses to adopt, he says, is the existence and worship of one God. He says we can do a lot of Old Testament theology by focusing on this particular theme. And then also to mention Robin Routledge's Old Testament theology that takes a thematic approach. finally, here are some resources to be aware of in looking at the broad subject of Old Testament theology.